Hello. Today we're going to review what we've done, talking about the Renaissances in the 1500s, and then move from culture over to economics, trade, and politics to think about how the world is being run in 1500. And our main theme is absolutism and absolute monarchy. I've got here just a review from last time, so let's start with that. What sort of the map of the world looks like around 1500, and we've talked about the power structure really firmly based over in China, the most powerful place in the world, the wealthiest. We'll talk about them a little bit more today. We talked last time a lot about the Mughal Empire in India, one of the Islamic empires, and the Ottoman Empire stretching around here, another Islamic empire, and then the fragmented nature of Europe kind of clawing their way up to the top. As we head out of the 1500s. One of the main things we looked at last time was how to use artifacts as sources. So how to think about architecture and art as a way of telling us about the values and the structure of societies. So just to refresh your memory, we had Suleiman the Great, who we'll return to today briefly, and the mosque that he commissioned by Mimar Sinan in the 1550s. Kind of a direct moment of competition between Europe and the Ottomans to see who can build a bigger dome, who can glorify God kind of more perfectly. That's the Ottoman Empire. We also talked about Mughal India. I think especially the idea of cultural fusion, although we saw it in all three. This is the outer wall of the Lahore fort, as you recall, the one with the Chinese dragon images and the European angels mixed together with Persian mosaic themes, and the largest mural in the world, again, celebrating the power of Mughal India and the rulers. Meanwhile, of course, in Europe, we have the same kind of strutting going on through architecture. We have St. Peter's in Rome, which we talked about really being the catalyst. The building of this is the catalyst for the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Also an opportunity, obviously, to reassert the idea of Rome being kind of the home base for Europe. And Michelangelo, Bramante, Raphael with the School of Athens inside that we looked at, the dome here, just thinking about sort of the messages that Europe is sending. We also talked about art in particular, sort of the style of painting in India, which I think is very important to remember that art in the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire, as you were reminded with the video and the worksheet, is really a top-down environment, right? So the Sultan, the emperor control the production of the art. They hire the workers. People are sort of toiling anonymously to some degree in the workshop, creating sort of whatever their patron tells them to. It's much more centralized, the production of art. Really the production of everything is more centralized in these bigger empires like the Ottoman and Mughal empires. Whereas in Europe, obviously we have something different. We do have bodies that are patrons like the Catholic Church, but we also have individual people that are patrons. We talked about the Renaissance in Europe, especially being characterized by this revival of antiquity, this idea of looking backwards towards ancient Greece and ancient Rome, exemplified in this painting here, The Birth of Venus, also in Raphael's School of Athens and some of the other works that we looked at. This idea that it's kind of a code, a language to speak, to show you're sophisticated, to understand and know what happened before, take the best of what the ancient world has to offer, and then add a modern for them twist by celebrating the greatness. So we have the revival of antiquity and also the idea of humanism, that humans are valuable and important, that they're worth attending to, even individuals like the Mona Lisa or like these two friends from France, having Holbein paint a picture of themselves on their great adventure as they go to be diplomats in England in the 1530s for Henry VIII's court. So I think this sense of people wanting more individual attention, both as subjects of paintings, but of course also as artists, is a real feature that we can see embedded in the European culture that's a little bit different. We see the rulers and we know who they are. We don't know so much the everyday people in the other cultures. We don't have the same cult of individuals of either of the artist or of the subject. I hope that helps your review. Obviously reach out with questions in the discussion board or via Slack. Today I want to turn our attention to what's going on with economics and politics. And let's look briefly at something I think, it says page 57, that's a different book, sorry. I think this is something you already learned in 5th grade. But basically when we begin World History 2, if you end World History 1, you have this big giant moment of exchange. So while all of the Renaissance's ideas are going on and the cultural exchange, we talked about Eurasia, there's also this totally ginormous project of sending goods and ships all the way across the world. The original idea is to get to the Indian Ocean area. If you recall, when Columbus bumps into the Bahamas, he calls them Indians because he thinks he's gotten to India, which is a lucrative area where he's trying to get. In fact, he has not. He's bumped into, quote, the New World to us, to the Americas. And so the exchange that starts, in 1492 and continues is often called the Columbian Exchange after Columbus. And if you just take a minute to zoom in on this list, and some of this you may already be familiar with, but I do think it's worth remembering. This is a map that has a list of things that only used to exist in the Americas, and then they get traded back to Africa and Eurasia, and vice versa, things that only existed in Eurasia or in Africa and then showed up in the Americas. And I think you'll find some really, maybe some surprising goods here. I think we all know, like from Thanksgiving, right, the stuff that originated in the Americas. You can see here pumpkins, potatoes, sweet potatoes, all the things that we have like with that meal. Corn also, maybe you didn't know about avocados. Tomatoes always surprises me. I think, what were the Italians eating, before tomatoes? But those are unique from here. Chili peppers, then go back out, make a big difference in Chinese cuisine in addition to Europe. Okay, then from Europe, what are they bringing? So they're all coming, especially with grapes and wheat and olives, staples of the Mediterranean diet for bread, olive oil, and wine. Those things were all new for the Americas. I think even more importantly, they also bring domesticated animals. The Western Hemisphere has the bad luck of having only llamas as the domesticated animals that are indigenous there. The other ones all come. So you can see, if you look on this list, chickens, pigs, cattle, all of horses, all of those animals exist only in Europe, sheep. And so you can imagine when they show up, this is not just like a dietary change. This is a tremendous change, right? Now you can have chickens and have eggs anytime, or now you can have sheep and have wool, or sheep's milk, or lamb chops, right? So we have really this big swap here. It's not all good news, of course, right? A lot of what's also swapped is disease. So the Europeans especially bring smallpox, chickenpox, and other diseases, meningitis, measles, not on purpose, although later on purpose. I mean, later they'll put it on a blanket and give it to indigenous people, but not originally. Originally, it's brought by accident. It's just that Europeans have all been, and Africans and Asians have all been immune to these, or built up an immunity that the New World doesn't have. I guess it's somewhat fair to say that the Americans send back syphilis. So there's something there. Anyway, this is worth looking, zoom in, screenshot, or whatever you need, just to kind of get a sense for what's going on. And so as all these goods are circulating, there's going to be new trade routes that build up. And the focus is going to switch gradually from the Indian Pacific basin, where Columbus was trying to get, where the Europeans really wanted to be, over to the transatlantic network, which we'll talk more about in the next couple of weeks as well. One of the main things that's being traded here, I don't think it's on the list, is silver. So there were silver mines in Japan and China. The Europeans are at a bit of a disadvantage in this international trading network because they don't really have anything that other people want except for guns. Mostly what they want is the fine crafted luxury goods, the spices, the exotic things that are coming from China and India, especially. What they find in the New World by accident is silver mines. When Cortez and other Spaniards and their fleets show up, they quickly start mining for silver and gold. And the mine at Potosi in Bolivia, which is actually still in operation, there's a mountain called Silver Mountain, is immediately, one of the new focus places for drawing silver out. It's very dangerous work. It's hard work. It's still hard work. Locals are conscripted and forced to do it. It's a tax paid by labor, so that you don't owe money. You owe time spent in the mines or doing whatever else the Spanish tell you to do. So they employ a lot of indigenous people at first. I wanted to show you as an artifact. I mentioned we looked at the coins from Suleiman last time. I want to look at the Spanish piece of 8, probably the most famous coin of all time, a famous sort of treasure coin for pirates. But it really does embody, I think, this global network that we're seeing develop right now in the world. This example in particular, is from 1768, and it says Charles III, who's the king of Spain. See, it says Spain there in Latin, Rex King. And there's this coat of arms, 8 for the number 8. These are coins about 1.5 inches long, and they were worth 8 Spanish reales. And you could actually literally break them if you needed in half, like a $0.50 or a quarter. You know how we say quarter. And so you could break them up into pieces if you needed. But that's why they're called pieces of 8, because they're worth 8. On this side, we can see the Spanish crown over to the 2 different hemispheres. So the sense of dominance that the Europeans are feeling, the confidence that they're feeling, the date here. This is a symbol that means it's the silver that came from Potosi. So it actually was mined there. And I don't have a map of South America, but picture this, they get the silver out, and by the 1590s, there were 6 million pounds a year, 6 million pounds a year of silver coming out of Spanish America. And so it comes out of Bolivia, and for this particular case, they use llamas to move it down to up to Panama, and then across, so people carry it by land, across to the other side of Panama, where Spanish ships could wait and take the silver back to Spain. About 20% remained in the Americas, but 80% of the silver that comes out of the mines is sent off to the rest of the world. About 10% ends up in Asia. And so we can look here and see, because there were so many things that the Chinese in particular were selling, that people wanted, what we call China, right? Porcelain vases and plates and stuff like that, but also spices and tea, silk, other kinds of textiles. But the Chinese have a rule that their citizens have to pay taxes in silver. So silver is actually in demand. So you could take these pieces of 8, that you had minted in the New World, and then get them over to use to trade for new goods in China. So about 10% of the silver from the New World records show ends up in China. The rest of it's kind of fluctuating back and forth, right, in trade. And in fact, it becomes really an international currency, the piece of 8, which is why it's a pirate lore thing. But the British Museum has examples of pieces of 8 that have been overstamped with the marks of governments from Australia, from Indonesia, from Belgium, from Scotland. The American colonists used them. They got them from Caribbean trade before they had their own money established, and they would use them to trade. So it really is kind of this one artifact of this coin really tells us a lot about what's going on in the world at this time. And again, like with the cultural interconnectedness, the cultural fusion, I think we should think about economic connectedness. We talk about how we live in a global world right now, but I think it felt pretty global in the 1600s and 1700s as well. So just something to consider as we think about the economy. This also just reminds us, so here's India, where the Mughals are in charge, certainly in the beginning. And this tells us the kind of things that people are looking for, right? So they're trading for silk, cotton, spices, porcelain, opium, copper, gold, and tea. So you can see that kind of marked here. And again, this is where Columbus is trying to get. This seems to be like the prime place to go until the transatlantic economy starts building up. All right, let's switch from economics to politics, although I think, all these things are intertwined, right? Culture, economics, politics, it's really hard to separate. And I think you'll see as we talk about absolutism, how much of an echo, we already know a lot of things about government because we know about the art. So we just kind of came at it the other direction. So the main thing to remember is that this idea of absolute monarchy, or sometimes called absolutism, is the prominent way of governing society almost everywhere in the world, when we start the beginning of this course. So in the 15, 16, and 1700s, the norm is absolutism. I hope for you that seems a little bit confusing, why this kind of government, but maybe if you think of it from the ruler's point of view, wouldn't we all rather be absolute monarchs if we could? An absolute monarch means you have no one checking your power. So you don't have to deal with legislatures and a Senate, or oftentimes you don't even have to deal with the Constitution. There are no real legal checks on your power. That doesn't mean all these people are ruling the way you might imagine, like Hitler or Stalin were ruling, because they don't have the means to control society like at the 20th century level. But they certainly might have the demand to be very much in charge of their society. So let's think about maybe some of the sort of how do they defend absolutism? Obviously, I hope it's easy for us to think about the costs of absolutism. This is a portrait here of Louis XIV of France. He is a great like epitome of absolutism in Europe. And as you read from just the brief thing by Duke Saint-Simon, about his court and kind of the daily control that he exhibited. So I have a list of just some examples here. We already know absolute places: Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire. China also, which we haven't talked about yet, is an emperor system. France, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Russia, also the German states. The Pope is ruling absolutely in the area around Rome. But the goal of absolute rulers is not to be tyrants, right? The goal of absolute rulers is to strengthen the power of the dynasty. And dynasty, I think is the kind of rule that's inherited. So father, son, occasionally a daughter thrown in there, or a wife ruling for a young son. But in general, it's family rule, right? Inherited power. But nobody wants to leave their son or grandson a weak state, right? You don't want to have ruined the state. And so you want to strengthen the power and have the lineage, whatever you've inherited, in good hands, looking ahead to the next few generations. So you want to maintain the military and economic strength of your country. So you don't have there's no glory in ruling over a nation of paupers, says Thomas More. There's no benefit to you to not do this right. Is part of the defense of absolutism, is that these rulers, of course, have the best interest of their country, in the forefront of their minds. A great example of an absolute ruler is Suleiman, who now we've encountered for the second time here, well, third time if you count the reading. So I just want to remind you that the readings are from this source book, Europe in the Modern World. You access it through perusal, but you click through to folio, and I've got the documents there. You're welcome to read more than what I've assigned, but I want you to be able to read it in collaboration with other students. So you're divided into these groups. I think they max out at like 15 people. So if you're the first person or two to write, you're writing on something blank. But when you come back and annotate, you can ask questions and someone can come back and answer them. So the best thing might be, especially if you go early, is to go back later and check. I've got everything. Ideally, you're reading them before the Tuesday and Thursday they're due on the syllabus, but I want everything done by Friday night. So you don't have it hanging over your head in the weekend. You've got all your comments done by Friday at midnight. So what I want you to see looking through that, for example, the Busbek is a European, but he's stationed for 6 years in the Ottoman Empire. And so we have some selections from a letter that he wrote in 1555, where he talks about Suleiman's favorite concubine, his wife Roxelana, and the death of Suleiman's own son and grandson. And so as you read that, or if you've already read it, think back, what does this tell us about what it means to be an absolute ruler? What are some of the costs, right? There's a lot of anxiety even about your own children because they know they're going to be in charge next. Think back to Shah Jahan in Mughal India, right? Who was put in the Red Fort in Agra by his own son and locked away so that the son could take power. So there's an instability aspect, and that's certainly what Roxelana is trying to navigate here. With Suleiman, there's also obviously a lot of power. There's a lot of scheming cabinet members and advisors, and you've got to figure out who's who. But ultimately, it's your control, it's your call. So you see in the reading that Suleiman does indeed sign off on the death of his grandson. So just look back at that to kind of help strengthen your idea of what is absolutism. We have lots of examples of kingship in Europe. Some places are big kingdoms like France. Some places are small, like Frederick William is ruling over a small area, Brandenburg, which is going to become part of Germany, but not until the 1860s, so we have a ways to go. So think back about those texts, documents 2.3, 3.1, and 3.4. How did Frederick William, the French kings Henry IV and Louis XIV, what are they trying to control among their people? What are the lessons that they're learning? What are they thinking about? What does it mean to be a king? How do you succeed as a leader in Europe? And all of them certainly, France and in the German states, want to exert complete control over their area. So aspects of absolute rule, just like to take notes and make a list. One of the fastest ways to boost your prestige is to have a successful war. So an important job of a ruler is to maintain a strong military. I think we can see that's both to defend from outsiders, but also from internal threats, like the case in France with the concern about religion. There's a religious minority, a small group of Protestants in France, and the Catholics are constantly trying to navigate how much freedom do we give them? Are they going to be rebels and try and take us over? Henry IV of France, you see here, actually was a Protestant, but he converts to Catholicism when he becomes the heir to the throne through marriage. Complicated story, fascinating story, but you don't have to worry about it here. So strong army, control trade, right? I think we see that and ironically, when I was talking about Spain, I didn't even mention an unforeseen consequence of Spain's good luck in bumping into the Americas in Columbus's voyage is that they end up right with these millions of literally boatloads of silver arriving on their shores, but it causes massive inflation and it ends up destabilizing Spain's economy. So Spain is in a really great position for a brief moment, and then they can't quite adjust right. So it actually ends up, I think, hurting their economy. But the idea of controlling trade is really important for these leaders and keeping your nation economically strong. Another part that I think is really important is creating an image of strength. This idea of majesty, this idea of being appearing so powerful that nobody will cross you. I think that's part of what Suleiman does. I think it's absolutely what Frederick Williams is talking about. I think it's what Saint-Simon sees Louis doing. Louis builds his palace at Versailles. It's bigger and better than anyone else's palace. Louis requires every noble family to come and live there for a certain amount of time, so that they know who their host is, right? They know who's watching them. They know whose thumb that they're under. And I think this idea of you have to have the biggest house with the most servants, with the fanciest dinners, with the best musicians, the best artists under your employ, is also a really important aspect of this image of majesty that the absolute rulers want to send out. You'll also notice that absolute rulers across the board, from China, to France, are expanding their bureaucracy. And this is a word that we're going to see over and over again. We'll talk about with Napoleon. And every time we say a ruler gets stronger, we talk about expanding the bureaucracy. A bureaucrat, as you may know, is like somebody who works for the government, like a civil service. So we would think of it as like a tax collector, or maybe like the person who works at the DMV, if you had to go get your driver's license, right? Those are not always the best experiences of our daily life, but they're really important because then you have to get a license, and then you have to go to a special place and stand in line in a pre-COVID world, and pay your fee or take your test. Means that the government is run in an orderly way. Because if you don't have that bureaucracy, maybe you get driver's license because the local police officer takes a bribe. Maybe you don't even know how to drive, but you can just give them $20 and they won't arrest you. That's not an effective way to run a government, right? That's dangerous. And so the more people you have working for centralized government, the more power the centralized authority has, but also kind of the more everybody knows what the rules are, and it eliminates the chance for bribery and graft and theft and corruption at every level. So when we see kings expanding the bureaucracy, expanding the number of employees, I think we can see that means that they're strengthening their hold on the society and trying to keep it running more efficiently. Of course, another aspect is keeping peace, right? Like I mentioned before with the edicts from Henry and Louis, that it's really important that you not have uprisings at home by your own family, by other nobles, or by other groups perceived as outsiders. And so that's also something if you want to be able to pass along a secure throne to the next generation. China, we haven't talked about China yet. Okay, so this is Kangxi. The XI is pronounced like SH. And you just have to trust me that he is the most powerful man in the most powerful place on earth. He's ruling almost the exact same time as Louis XIV. So that kind of makes an interesting comparison. France is a very small, unimportant place. I study European history. So from a European historical point of view, France is really important. But in a world point of view, no one cares what France is doing at the same time period. Kangxi has all the power. And this is a formal imperial portrait, imperial meaning from the word empire, painted on silk. You can see how ornate it is. There's other pictures of him on horseback. He like Louis is, concerned about his image of majesty, his image of being above and separate from other people, being kind of godly, almost literally divine. Both Louis and Kangxi claimed that they were ruling because the gods or God had chosen them to, the divine right of kings. Under Kangxi's rule, the Chinese history is measured in dynasties. If you've taken History 1111, you may already know. It's measured by who the family is in charge. And so he's in charge during the Qing dynasty, spelled with a Q. And during this period, they're Manchu, like the Mughals from India. They come from outside, and so they've got to kind of blend in and find a way to not lose completely their culture, but also to assimilate and adapt enough to control a foreign culture. So they come in and he consolidates the borders. He's a good conqueror. You can't tell in this picture, but in other pictures, he makes that case for himself. But he's also a good administrator. And China's famous for its bureaucracy, its Confucian system that requires lots of exams for scholars. They look very highly on their Confucian scholars who help administer. China's a huge place. And so to administer your government takes a lot of layers. This is sort of a silly example, but I think it gives us a way to remember about absolutism. So when the Manchu dynasty comes to power, the hairdos are different. In the Qing dynasty, the Manchu had worn their hair in a different way than the previous dynasty in the Ming. And so one of the things they want to do is mandate that everybody start wearing Qing hair. So a small example of absolutism, not political, but I think the idea of your reach being so big. And so this is the long uncut and bound hair that used to be popular, that symbolized, it says virility, filial piety, like loyal piety, social control, and the Han ethnicity. Now we have a different idea of social control, submission to Manchurian authority. Now prove it with your hair. When we walk down the street, we'll know if you're with us or against us. Peter the Great does the same thing in Russia. We haven't talked about Russia much yet either. Russia's in kind of this weird place where it's like connected so closely to China that sometimes it's Asian, but it's also got a window into Europe, so it's also European. Peter really wants to take them in the European direction. He goes and visits the rest of Europe, and he notices that hardly anyone in Europe is wearing beards. In Russia, everyone has beards because it's so cold. So he comes home and demands everybody shave off their beards. Many people resist. So he ends up having like a beard tax. But again, this control of hair, right? Of showing your loyalty in even such an obvious way. Like, are you doing what the king, what the emperor want you to do? I think is a way to remember kind of the long reach of absolutism and what kind of influence that these rulers want to have, even beyond edicts, beyond economics, right? They also want cultural. And we can think about that also, I think, with the art, right? We talked about how the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire, things are very centralized in their workshops. They control what buildings are built, what kind of paintings are painted, who's hired as an artist, in a way that is just kind of not possible in Europe because things are so much more fragmented, politically and culturally. Okay, I forgot to notice when we started, but just to wrap up. So absolutism, all those examples, and look back at the readings, I think, for some more information. But I want you to know there is a really important exception to the rule, and that's in England, coincidentally or not, right, where America gets its founding fathers' ideas. So looking much more to the tradition in England than the tradition elsewhere in Europe or in the East. I don't want to tell the whole story. I just wanted to put up some points here, but basically England, of course, you'd want to be an absolute ruler, and Henry VIII is a good example of somebody who wants more control. He even breaks England off from the Catholic Church famously. Remember, he wants a divorce to marry Anne Boleyn, and the Pope says no. And so he says, fine, I'll be the head of the church. So it creates a whole new version of Christianity called the Anglican Church in England and called the Episcopal Church in America. So Henry wants to have a lot of control. He dies, he has a son who rules only briefly, and then he has two daughters. Elizabeth ends up being kind of the most famous one. The Elizabethan age is when Shakespeare's living. It's a high point in British history, in English history. And Elizabeth has kind of had to compromise with the people to sort of stabilize things from the ups and downs of her father's reign, who's getting killed for being Catholic, who's not. She dies without an heir. She never marries, and the throne goes to her cousins, who are from Scotland. There's the two different families, the Tudors and the Stuarts, which is, don't worry about that. It goes to some cousins, and basically they overreach. And we end up with England in the Civil War in the 1630s. And Charles I, seen here looking quite dapper and relaxed, maybe not majestic enough, is beheaded and found guilty of treason in the Civil War. And at this point, it's going to take a while to rebuild, and it's really not until the 1680s that things are going to stabilize in England. But by the end of that, after 2 generations of fighting, there's going to be this sense that the English monarch has got to answer to the English Parliament, which is their legislature, right, like our Congress, and that they have to work with Parliament, that they can't have a lot of control. And it's in this kind of moment, as we head into the 1700s, that we have really important new ideas about political theories coming out of England, most especially John Locke's theory, the second treatise on government, which we'll read for next class. And we'll talk more about Enlightenment ideas. So there's this little corner of Europe percolating some new ideas, putting into practice something different than absolutism. But in general, everybody else, absolutism is the rule of the day. I hope that makes sense, and you've got it all clear. If not, reach out with questions, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you.